Looks like people have arrived, so I'm going to take this moment to welcome everyone to our afternoon keynote by Dr. Saraliza Anzaldúa. Saraliza is our newest faculty member here at PCC. She's going to be talking to us about mutants and monsters, the fine line of humanity and developmental ecology according to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So help me in welcoming Dr. Anzaldúa.
So first things off, just a mention of some hazards ahead. There's a mention of some eugenics and pretty dark stuff in the middle, but then we'll move on to the fun stuff. So why mutants? Well, depending on your cosmology, certain bodies will be marked as deviant, and based on how that deviance is interpreted, those bodies may be marked as monsters, freaks, marvels, or mutants. And unfortunately, such bodies have historically been marked for excessive control and death. So by unpacking our assumptions, by investigating how our cosmology is bound up with those assumptions about what is natural and unnatural and how those affect bodies, we can be not only more conscious of those biases and assumptions, but move towards a more holistic way of understanding cosmology. This is a picture of John Eckert, known by his stage name Johnny Eck, who was a magician, a performer in the early 20th century. So first, I'd like to introduce what's called a typological view. So this is a view where you assume that the world is set up by certain kinds, and that each of those kind is bound up with certain essential characteristics. Importantly, within that kind, there is little to no variation, and any variation that you do see is perceived as a deviance from that category, interpreted as an error. So some examples we're going to go through is divine cosmology, natural philosophy, and modern hardline geneticists. This is an example of a blonde zebra in Tanzania. So on the typological view, the blonde zebra is a deviant anomaly within that category and can be variously interpreted as a marvel, a monster, or a mutant. So there's the divine cosmological view, where you assume that the world is a divine creation and that that divine will has set up certain types, and variation within that type can be interpreted as an omen, a punishment, or a wonder, depending on the will of that divine entity. So this is an example of the monster Ravina, who was interpreted as an omen of war in Italy in 1512. So because it's an anomaly, people aren't normally born like this, with wings, with a single leg, with an eye. It's interpreted as a kind of divine sign. And there was a lot of debate on what exactly this sign meant. A second example of a typological cosmology is natural philosophy or early modern science. So this was a move away from the idea that each variation or deviation was a divine intervention, and more looking towards nature as an explanation of why variation and deviance occurred. So it still relied on categorical kinds, but those variation within those kinds took on a variety of positions of explanations. So on the one end, a variation was explained as just a mistake of nature. So the rules of nature weren't followed, and it was beholden on natural philosophy or early modern science to understand those rules. And once those rules were understood, you can prevent any mistakes from occurring. On the other end of a position was that, well, it's just a wonder of nature. Miraculous things are happening all the time, and isn't that pretty cool? And by looking at these wonders and marvels, we get a better understanding of the whole picture of the possibility of nature. So this view is summed up by Etienne Saint-Hilaire. Monsters are not sports of nature. The organization is subject to rules, to rigorously determined laws. Monsters are also normal beings, or rather, there are no monsters. Nature is one whole. So there was a range of explanation for how the rules of nature weren't followed, anything from too much semen, not enough semen, the womb was too narrow for the birth imagination of the mother affected the formation of the fetus, sitting position of the mother, nutrition, so many explanations. But the basic idea is that the rules weren't followed. So here's an example of an illustration of conjoined twins in Isidore Saint-Hilaire, the son of Etienne, who carried on his father's work in teratology, trying to understand how the rules of nature, how nature develops, and what causes these rules to produce deviation and malformations. In these two early typological views, the role of hybridity was pretty significant. So you had a lot of markers of the monster. Something was too big for its categorical kind, something was too small, it had too many limbs, not enough limbs. But one of the most significant characteristics was hybridity. So when two categories overlap, it's part this, part that. And it was a visible marker of the transgression of boundaries that were assumed to be not only distinct, but something almost sacred, because it is something characteristic of nature itself, a cosmological rule that can't be broken. And so hybrid bodies, as an example of the famous Minotaur, were viewed as violations of nature, and which necessitated control, management, or eradication. So what happened to the Minotaur, as part bull, part human, locked in a labyrinth. And so hybrids, even though early medieval philosophy moved away from the divine cosmological view, still viewed hybrid as deviant monsters in need of control. So it turns out typology is a kind of ideological view that's pretty hard to get rid of. So hardline geneticists fall into the typological category, where they assume that certain amount of kinds occupy the world, and that those kinds can basically be summed up in their genes. Importantly, there's little to no variation in genetic types, and that anomalies can be explained because the genes went wrong. So either just bad genes or malformations of genetic expression. So this view can be summed up in a quote by Armand Leroy: "Mutations are deficiencies in particular genes, errors made by machinery that copies or repairs DNA." So on the typological position, this two-headed turtle is an anomaly because its genes went bad. So the problems with typology is that it doesn't account for variations within populations. So it's really hard to pin down what exactly an essential feature is. There's variations within populations across all populations. So if you have red hair, you have blue eyes, that's a mutation. It's a genetic malformation on the typological view. Humans born without limbs, dogs without fur, birds without flight, wings. The hardline geneticist doesn't account for variations within the population, nor does it account for variation between populations. So kinds evolve generationally over time, and importantly, they co-evolve with other populations. So there's always a sharing of genes and an overlap of populations that are assumed on the hardline geneticist view, the typological view, to be distinct. So you can think of examples. We shared genetic makeup with chimpanzees and Neanderthals, but we also share genetic material with other populations you wouldn't expect, roundworms and mice, due to bacterial and viral transfer. There's even some evidence that we share genetic makeup with chickens, which is a fun party philosophy question. How related to a chicken do you have to be before it becomes cannibalism? And third, there's a problem that the importance of development is overlooked. So it ignores the significance of internal and external environments for the development of both individuals and characteristics across various populations. So importantly, genes are only part of the picture. You can think of the lack of genetic sex determination in temperature-dependent species. So on the typologist view, if you want to know the sex of something, test its genes. That doesn't really work for turtles because their sex expression is determined by the temperature of the gestating egg. So you could also think of the example of certain beetles. Why does the beetle have no horns, small horns, big horns? The typologist will think, oh, test its genes, but that's not how that works. It's more determined by nutrition, the location and size of eyes. And you can also think of locomotive behavior. So how we develop our neural pathways and our muscles is more dependent on spontaneous movement. So think back to the picture of Johnny Eck at the beginning. If the ability to walk was in his genes, that doesn't explain how he was able to move, to locomote. That's something that spontaneously happens as you interact with the world, which develops your neural pathways and muscles. You're not going to find that kind of information in your genes. And one of the biggest problems of typology is it can lead to extreme cases of harm. So imposing one's typological view on a world that doesn't match it can lead to some pretty dark places. You have a eugenicist as the racial typologist. So we can think about the impact of involuntary sterilization in the US, biased IQ tests that determine educational tracks, and better breeding organizations that have and continue to still push anti-miscegenation laws. You can think of sex and gender typologists in the medical field and its impact on intersex individuals with non-fatal conditions that are forced to undergo involuntary surgeries in order to better fit a constructed category imposed on them. So this can be something as aesthetic as, oh, your clitoris is too big, so we're gonna reduce it to make you match what we think a female should be, which of course destroys the sexual function and neural pathways. We can also think of the management and eradication of bodies with disabilities that are either exploited in entertainment and forced to undergo sterilization or institutionalized and incarcerated. So in all these examples, the body that doesn't fit neatly into a typological category is marked for in need of control or to be corrected because it's viewed as a deviant, in extreme case on the typological view as a monster. So in opposition to typological thinking, we can think of developmental thinking, which is characterized by attention to an evolutionary history. It allows for flexibility within and between populations, and it emphasizes an interstitial relationality between populations with potential alternatives within populations. So we can think of the example of epigenetics. This is a picture up top of the epigenetic landscape by Conrad Waddington. So if you think of the ball as the gene, and as the genes develop and express, it rolls down valleys and hills that are a landscape that is underpinned by pegs that can be tightened or loosened. And depending on the landscape, which has the potential to change, that will affect the expression of the genes and its development. So this has consequences for not only how we understand variation within populations. Here's pictures of corn. On the typologist view, some of these corn don't count as corn. Whereas on the developmental thinking of an epigeneticist will say, yeah, that's all corn, and that's the history of corn. And that leads to potential future alternatives of corn we can't anticipate. We can think of the variation between populations. On the typologist view, elephants and manatees are two separate categories. But the developmental thinker will say, well, no, they have a common ancestor, and they're actually related. We can also think of co-evolving interdependence. Bees and flowers aren't two separate categorical kinds. They co-evolved so that flowers rely on bees to pollinate and bees rely on flowers for their food and their life cycle. Now the fun part. So it turns out narrative can lead us away out of typology. So it's really interesting to use narrative as a way to shift consciousness because of what's called phenomenological affective transmission. So if you watch a sad movie and you're bound up with the protagonist, you get sad too. If you are upset about a breakup and one of your favorite upbeat songs comes on the radio, that shifts your consciousness. Now you're happy. Now you're bouncing along to that beat. So by thinking of a comic narrative, we can understand what's it like to live in a typological world that marks your body as monstrous. We can also know what it's like to live in a developmental world that accepts you as one of many possibilities. And with that awareness, we can think of a way to shift our consciousness towards developmental thinking. So a very, very, very brief introduction to TMNT. So Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird in 1984 wrote a series of Mirage comics that developed into a 1987 TV show, 2003 TV show, 2012 TV show, 2018, a few movies in 2024, and an incalculable amount of IDW comic arcs. But across all these universes, it always starts with 4 turtles that are mutated by an ooze or what's sometimes called a mutagen. And their father/teacher is either a rat given human qualities or a human that takes on rat qualities. and they fight the Foot Clan, which is an evil ninja organization headed by the Shredder, who is bent on world domination. And the Shredder is hell-bent on destroying Turtles and Splinter because they stand in the way of his domination of the world. So in the earlier universes in the franchise, the series starts with a lot of the hybrid creatures boundary crossing that we saw with the natural philosophy view. So just a few examples, I've mentioned Splinter. There's also their human ally, April, that becomes a cat in one episode, but then is restored to her former human form. In the more recent franchise, a former foot ninja enemy becomes their ally, is wounded while aiding them, and is given a transfusion by Leonardo and takes on turtle qualities. So in all these cases, we can see hybridity at work, where two categories overlap, and that marks them as a deviant, monstrous body. And this typological position is reiterated throughout earlier franchises. One example, Shredder, the villain, shouts at a mutant, "Man over beast, that is the natural order, bow to your master." So reiterating that not only are there categorical kinds assumed in the world, but there's a hierarchy to that world. Where in the latter franchises, there is a shift towards a developmental view. So in the top picture, that's from the 2012 series, the alien Krang, who is a villain ally of Shredder, we find out that actually they've been mutating the world millions of years ago, since millions of years ago. So everything on the planet Earth is a mutant. And they've been purposely mutating the Earth so that they could make it more hospitable to their kind so that they can take over. In the low bottom of the screen is a still from the 2018 Rise series. We find out that an alien crankship crashed, spilled the mutagen, and a bunch of yokai mutants have developed their own world. So they have a lot of human features, but they're their own distinct kinds. They're not like the hybrid crossover in previous series. So they have hotels, spas, and really enjoy roller derby and all kinds of stuff, which I think is pretty cool. Some clarifications. So I'm not saying that typology and developmental is a kind of good guy versus bad guy dichotomy. So even the turtles exhibit some typological thinking in some cases. They're watching a movie and Michelangelo comments on how hairy an actor playing a werewolf is. And Raph says, well, what do you expect? He's half animal. So what I'm saying is that there's a dialectic going on in the series that shifts towards one end of the spectrum and back towards the other. And by paying attention to how your outlook, how you are positioned in cosmology, what that determines on your outlook of those bodies. So you can think of this in our own lives. If I showed you an orange and a lemon, you would say, yeah, two distinct things. But then if I went on to tell you, actually, these have common ancestors and a lot of crossbreeding, and there's a lot of variation within these categories, you would think, oh yeah, okay, lots of potential within categories, overlap between categories. And it's just a matter of keeping an open and curious mind. I'm also not saying that just because you have a typological view, you necessarily want to take over the world. Although, as we've seen in the examples of extreme harm I mentioned, the possibility is there. And lastly, even though TMNT might not be the best scientific resource for how mutations actually work, as a phenomenological exercise, I do still think it's worthwhile to consider not only how the narrative impact of understanding of typology versus developmental thinking can give us, but also the phenomenological affect transmission that I mentioned earlier. So what can we learn? Well, we learn what it's like to exist as a monstrous binding topological world. The mutants in this series are always targeted either by villain or government organizations for experimentation. Here's a still of Bishop that kidnapped Splinter, their father, in 2003 series. To the right is a really heartbreaking still from when Michelangelo goes to his martial arts hero, Chris Bradford, thinks that they're friends, but finds out that Chris Bradford works for the Shredder. Chris Bradford kidnaps, ties up Michelangelo to lure his family into a trap. And Michelangelo, with tears in his eyes, said, "I thought you were my friend. Um, why are you doing this?" And Chris Bradford says, "You really thought someone like me could be friends with a freak like you? Pathetic." And your heart just breaks along with him because of his body. He's not even granted the basic kindness and compassion of friendship. So we see how being in that body takes a spiritual and psychological toll. And the turtles and other mutants are forced to hide in the shadows, even though they're very much part of the communities. So much so that they take it upon themselves to help people that frequently react to them with anger, with fear. And we can see that play out and kind of hesitate to adopting that view because we see the extreme consequences that those views can take, as in the case of hate, humans against the extraterrestrials. So in 2003, there's a terrorist organization that steals a nuclear bomb to blow up New York because it's infested with aliens and mutants. We also see an example of Bishop in Tales of the TMNT. She is a roboticist whose work was destroyed when the turtles were trying to save New York from Superfly, who was basically leveling the city, and so blames all mutants and develops robots to exterminate mutants. But like robots do in Hollywood narratives, they gain sentience and realize, oh, well, humans are mutants too, so I'm just going to exterminate everybody. And we're more likely, because of seeing those extreme cases, to be open to the possibility that our assumptions might be wrong, and that in fact the world is made up of variation, that it's just a natural part of development, both within and between populations. And in a divergence from all other universes, in the Mutant Mayhem movie, the turtles are welcomed in the community. They go to high school, they go to prom. And finally, we're more mindful of our integral relationships as part of a co-evolving, co-creating network. So we're aware that humans are not the exception. We're not some isolated atom on our own journey, that we're deeply embedded in the world and part of the web of life. So we move from the kind of chain of being that keeps things isolated in a hierarchy, that we're on our own path more towards an interconnectedness with all things, because that's just how life is. So this is The Tree of Life by Leonard Eisenberg. It's called Tree of Life, but the term being more adopted is Shrub of Life. So the human is actually just the tiniest little branch at right there somewhere. Because you see that not only are we deeply embedded and connected with everything, but we're only just a small part, and we're deeply interdependent with everything else. And in fact, our own journey has potential within it itself. So moving from the march of progress to a more blossoming variation of possibility, not only within our own category, but between categories as well. And I think this is all summed up when Donatello, who's trying to not only save Bishop from her own robots, but save his brother's shouts, when Bishop says, "I want to destroy all mutants, but we're all mutants." Thank you, and turtle power. Any questions? No? Okay, deuces. Oh. Nice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it depends. So if you're talking about the X-Men franchise, they're very much treated like mutants. So we have that typological overlap, like, no, you shouldn't be able to levitate. You shouldn't be able to manipulate fire. And there's even a whole government organization devoted to managing and exterminating mutants in that universe. I'm not as versed in DC and the Marvel superhero, so I can't say much about that. I will say, though, in more contemporary films, it does seem like there is some tension. So I know, what was it? The one where the government tries to contract superheroes and say you can only act within like certain stipulations. And then there was that, like, the Avengers war, go to Civil War or something. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, hmm. So, and I will say, even in the cases, so I'm thinking of like early Superman comics when they're held up as a hero, it's only because of the function and the utility that they serve that they're accepted. Um, and I think that in the Mutant Mayhem film recently, that is addressed as well, because the idea that the turtles have of like, well, let's become superheroes is because they want to be accepted. There's this heartbreaking moment. So in that still I had where they're like crawling in the shadows of the subway on a supply run to grab food. They're like, Raph says, I love all y'all, but I don't want your faces to be the last thing I see before I die. I need a life. I need to like live. And so they come up with this idea to like be heroes. And then when Superfly tries to level New York, Leo gives, the hero speech of like, we're doing this for the wrong reasons to be accepted. We need to do this because it's the right thing to do. So I do think that tension of like your body is only accepted based on its use for us being power and authority, then we'll overlook the fact that you're a deviant than a mutant. But that still doesn't make it okay. But there's probably room to play with that in interpretation. I mean, I mentioned that there's so many arcs within the IDW universe. And that's part of the fun of the comic media. You have like so many things that are canon that contradict each other, because writers and artists get to play with these characters, and multiple universes, each with their own tension and contradiction, get to interplay and cross over and like, dimensional timeline travels and all that. I think Sean had a question. Hmm. Yeah, there's all kinds of developmental thinking. So there's certain kinds of indigenous cosmologies that have developmental thinking, especially in those where shape shifting and transformation happens, so flexibility between populations. That's not to homogenize like all indigenous cosmologies, because some are typological. There are a set amount of kinds in the world, and they are the thing that they are and have always been that thing. To the second part of your question, so I can't say it's always the case, but it's pretty typical of like medieval philosophy, especially as it develops into an Enlightenment science, that the development of a type, at least in regards to human, is very much rooted in a kind of eugenicist typology. So if you've ever seen the hierarchy of the races depicted, it's very much that. The black bodies are the primitive ape-like bodies, and then you get the Asiatic bodies, the mestizo bodies, and the white bodies. So it's the development of type, but there really is only one type that counts. And so, yeah, I would say that that's very much a typological view on the world, that basically if you're not on top, you lose out, and everything else is just the way to get to the top. And yeah.
Normally, development, for instance, Saraliza, for instance, will criticize theory by saying that mind somehow emerges out of matter, so develops from matter without recognizing ultimate matter. So mind is already there as a potential waiting to unfold, which is to develop and be developed. So maybe what you're looking at is just a multiple development is coming at emergence of multiple potentials without any
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. I guess what I'm focusing on is the history of cosmology in terms of how they see deviant bodies. I haven't really addressed anything in terms of consciousness, either because embedded in the typological view, at least the ones I'm addressing here, certain bodies are assumed to just not have internal internal subjectivity, and what they do have is a kind of imitation. It's a parody. So their inability to reason, their kind of shadow subjectivity that really doesn't count as subjectivity. In terms of a cosmological view that addresses the development of consciousness, I haven't really encountered it in the material I'm addressing here. But if I take what your position to be, that consciousness develops and emerges, and within that emergence, it's multiplicitous, I would count that as the developmental view. I don't see those two things as mutually exclusive.
Love to see Ninja Turtles mashed up with some really important philosophical concepts. I also love that you're bringing in Conrad Waddington, who you may know was influenced by Whitehead, as I did the Creole and the epigenetic landscape. And the shift from thinking in terms of like the purity of lineages to thinking more in terms of evolution as a hybridization all the way down, more networked, more of a network of relationships than lineages that represent separate types. And as you just said in response to Sean, you're focusing on bodies here. And I wonder if I can ask you about souls, let's say, and that to mean mind, consciousness, as broadly as you want. And I think of something actually Aristotle says, who's probably like the typologist extraordinaire, his great train of being and all of that. But he also says about the soul, he says the soul is in a way all things. So the soul is quite mutable, quite protean, and can take on the forms of. So I wonder, when you do bring in souls in addition to bodies, how does your framework about mutants shift, if at all, or have you thought about mutant souls?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. My intuition is to say that I don't see a mutual exclusion between developmental view and ensoulment. I think not only like when we say soul, we have a very vague idea. But when you really get down to it, there are so many ways to interpret ensoulment. Not only in terms of like, Aristotle had the three souls, but there's the ensoulment of like rocks and plants, which may be a different type of soul in the non-Aristotelian view, but that are still equal to like human consciousness. One doesn't, the human consciousness isn't like prioritized in any way. And so I think it would really depend on how you understand spirit, and the type of, importantly, cosmology it's embedded in. So I'm thinking in terms of like For example, Aztec Mexica cosmology, you have like 3 souls, and while one is something that you were born with, your heart soul, your tonality is like developing over the course of your life. And it's affected by your nutrition, how much sun you get, the people around you, so many things. And so it's a much more flexible developmental thing that's interstitial to the world around you. So that's very developmental, whereas maybe in other cosmologies, it looks a lot more like the topological view. The body you're born with grants you a certain kind of soul. And so if you have good body, you have like the best soul. But if you don't, if you're deviant in any way, maybe you only have like partial reasoning, or you're only partially conscious of your experience. And so on that view, it looks much more towards the typological view. So I think it's a range, and you really have to get down to the nitty-gritty details to determine on what end on the spectrum it comes out on.
What's the third type of Aztec soul?
Your ihilot, which is, depending on the community, can either be associated with your liver or your kidneys, and that's kind of like your weaving soul. So if you've ever met if you've heard the term like malere, buenere, the air of a person. So if there's like a person that you meet, like, man, I feel like so uplifted by the person. They have really good air. Alternatively, maybe you know someone who's like super cringe and you always feel like depleted around them. That's their ihilot weaving with you and affecting your own body, your own souls, your own spirits. So many more questions popped up.
Awesome presentation. I love that intro and
Yeah.
there was a part in your presentation where you mentioned that technology doesn't need to go in the direction of
Yeah, I think especially in just like modern American society and the way our education system is set up, and the way our lives are structured to be like always functional towards capitalist ends, we don't have a lot of time to nurture our development muscle. Everything is typological. This is a podium. It's here for my purposes. And I have to take the extra effort of like, oh yeah, but before that it was wood, and it was a tree, there was a seed, and probably came from other seeds. So that my initial reaction of like, yep, podium is a podium, was a podium, will always be a podium. Well, probably, I mean, I can't say what it is, but my intuition is it's probably not going to lead me to become a eugenicist dictator of any sort. So I think that these kind of daily practices of typology are not necessarily problematic. My point is more that if we aren't aware of what it is, and we don't develop our awareness as developmental thinkers, then it can be co-opted by systems that we then feed into these more extreme cases of harm. Yep.
Thank you, Saraliza. Like everyone else, I really enjoyed this. At one point, when you were talking about typology and developmental contrast, and then you used the typological system, but that developmental approach allowed you to say these are all bananas.
Corn?
Or corn.
Oh, corn.
Bananas. Here they got hungry. I guess my question is how does saying these are all corn not also engage in like typological? Like how is it that we can still is there space within is it a question of like center of gravity and priority of how much attention one gives to naming versus like a long contextual eventual description of something, but clearly like we still want to be able to name. There's something powerful about being able to recognize difference and recognize like the recognition of difference can also be a sort of break that things are foreign.
Yeah, I think it is again developing a contextual development consciousness, and that it's always in flux. It's always something that's in process. It's never static. So if I were like going back to that example of the picture, if I were to say, okay, these things here depicted are corn and only this, that's a very like hard static position to take, and that probably didn't encapsulate the whole history of corn. And so I think there, like as you said, just like the ability to name something is quite powerful. So I don't see a mutual exclusion between, yeah, that's corn, but there could also be future possibilities of different corn. And there's also a past of corn that I'm not aware of. And corn is probably related to an innumerable number of species that I will probably never be aware of just because I don't have the time. I'm a limited temporal spatial being. And I think just taking that kind of position of context, history, and interstitiality is just a good muscle to develop. But that doesn't exclude my ability to say, yeah, I would like my meal with a side of corn. Yeah, sorry. I have not seen Sesame Street. And this, like, you put me on the spot because, like, you know, I know this is being filmed. And so, uh, yeah, but that's great to hear. I don't think so. Um, I think TMNT is probably one of the best cases for taking on these cosmological questions, but there are definitely other narratives, other artistic forms of expression that are addressing like similar issues, and that's really cool that Sesame Street is like taking on that. I think it's important to introduce these questions very early on because you know, it's a very, as I mentioned, typology tends to be a really hard ideological position to shift from. And if it's developed very early on, it can be like really hard to move that muscle once it's like frozen in place. You got to like stretch it out. You got to like move it a little bit. And we don't always have the time, you know, especially in our society where we have a housing crisis and so many things going on. The world's literally on fire. Yeah. Um, if I can ask a clarification, what do you mean by like good guy typologists? Yeah, so I mentioned that I don't see this as a dichotomy between, you know, good versus evil. Even good people can take on topological thinking, and I don't think it's just like an innate category. So I think it's a consciousness that one develops, that one takes on. In terms of its connection with survival of the fittest and utilitarianism, I think there's definitely some examples where typology is an ideology that is based on one's intuition of what is natural, kind of natural fallacy. And if you happen to have a privileged body and you have a overinflated sense of ego of like, yeah, I'm the cream of the crop and I'm the best it's gonna get, certainly that can turn into a, yes, this is the pinnacle of what it is to be a human, and everything else is just kind of low on the ladder. And we see that in terms of, as Lily mentioned earlier, kind of the example of superheroes functioning as an arm of militarization. So as long as bodies are functional, their deviance can be overlooked. That's definitely an example of a typological, of a position rooted in a typological way of thinking. So I think that within typology, there's definitely a spectrum of positions that you can take, and it's connected to all sorts of other ways of thinking and conceptions of the world, because everything's connected, and it's an entangled system. Yeah. Uh-huh. Do you mean repurpose like the bodies or the terms monster and mutant? Yeah, so I think things can be monstrous. I don't think that there's anything, I don't think there are monsters. So monstrous is a relation, is a reaction based on a relation, things that the subject finds monstrous. Monster is a category based on a cosmology rooted in assumptions about the world. I don't think there's any such thing as a monster. I'm worried my fellow monster theorists are going to come for me. But there's definitely monstrosity, and that's based on relationality. I think mutant as a term, because it's bound up with a lot of, as we saw, hardline genetic views, and there's an ongoing conversation within evolutionary science about when a mutation just becomes part of a widely distributed characteristic and is no longer a mutation. I think, like the term freak, I tend to shy away from it because it's rooted in harm in a lot of cases, and the bodies labeled as mutant tend to be those that are disempowered and are more likely to be targeted for excessive control, and in the worst case scenarios, death. So I think as a developmental thinker, or at least I like to think I am, I like to think in terms of variation and potentialities. I would love if at the end of my life's work, there's a shift towards that type of language and not so much on the categorical of like, this term marks you as wrong and potential need of correction. I think that the way we use these terms, and especially in the horror industry, I was just talking about turtles, the whole nest of snakes in terms of how this language is weaponized in the horror genre, and especially how disabled bodies are marked as villainous, as monstrous, as the source, literal embodiment of evil, I think is very problematic.
But I really appreciated this. This was like a fun way to think about sort of like universe's pattern of creativity, and the deviance is, or at least in the developmental thinking way, kind of expanded the word deviance into one of novelty, or just figuring out configurations or reconfigurations. One of many possibilities of what
Hmm.
sort of, could you use the, I don't know what, could you use the Ninja Turtles as an example of why is the universe, what's the purpose, where is it headed towards creativity? Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles would speak to that.
It's an interesting question. Nothing comes to mind in terms of what I know of like interviews, backstories, that's an intent. I think that the universes are more focused on potentiality, not so much on where things are going. And I think that there's this common misconception that evolution, in terms of evolution, things only happen if it works. Things only happen if it doesn't kill off species before they can reproduce. That means that there's a lot of variation in developments that don't give us any benefit. It's just that they don't harm us. And so they just stick around, like blue eyes and red hair and all kinds of stuff. Those traits were picked up because they were given a cultural value as an aesthetic choice. We just liked the way they looked. And you find examples of that all across various populations. So I think that it points more into like the shrub of life. If things can branch out, if things can develop and change, it's going to happen. Not necessarily that it's driving towards an ultimate end.
I really liked how you talked about it. So I was just curious about any of the thinkers or philosophers, speaks to that.
I I am terrible with names, and I apologize to whoever wrote the transmission of affect, because there is a book that of that title that I had in mind when discussing that. But if you get with me after the talk, I have it on my laptop, and I can give you the reference.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. And, I was sitting here kind of thinking about things as, people asking questions and such, and it seems to me, I'm kind of thinking of it from a Gebserian kind of deficient mental consciousness standpoint, which, keeps splintering things further and further apart. And so it almost seems, this is my question, I mean, is there any sense that we're at an inflection point where when you're parsing things apart so specifically that the variation from the mean, if you will, there's more and more variation from the mean, which then kind of automatically flips you into a developmental mindset.
I think if that is the case, we are so bound up with our own intuitions, we probably don't notice. If you ask the average person just a few just a few general questions, you could probably suss out whether they lean more towards a typological and developmental thinking. And I think typological thinking is unfortunately just the default, especially given, we're all here at a university. So if you've followed any of the headlines about the state of education, as it is here in the US, typology is really hard to get rid of. And I think the way that we, in fact, just teach everything from history and science, it's very typological, right? This event happened, and conversations about how that event is interpreted or how it fits into a nationalist narrative that supports a kind of hierarchical typological view is like never discussed. And same thing with like science. This is a manatee, this is an elephant, move on. So yeah, but I'm interested to talk with you more about this inflection point and fracturing. I hadn't thought about it, but I think unless we develop that muscle, just like everything else to do with our bodies, because the mind is a muscle, we're going to be unaware of the potentiality and just like the wondrous world that we occupy. There's like so many things to encounter, and our assumptions about the world are constantly being challenged.
Just you didn't answer this. Thinking about like the physical forms, but also ideas and tendency to monsterize. I think we all kind of all have that, right? And I think you're asking us to confront that, or at least just notice it. I wonder if you have any tips for noticing when you are monsterizing something that is a monster to you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think the first thing to do is notice what's going on in your body, because when you're confronted with something that's monstrous, your heart is going to start racing, you're going to start sweating. So that's just mindfulness practice. Whoa, what's going on with my body? And then taking the additional step of like, okay, what am I thinking? And I think doing those two things in the context of what is the thing that's frightening me, and recognizing that this, whatever the thing is, has its own life, its own right to exist, and then working through that, because it is a working through that, right? Yeah, because the human mind is really good at projecting. We assume that whatever was going on in here is also going on out there. And so recognizing that as much as we are scared, as much as we are angry, that's not the rest of the world. And I think especially in terms of how that looks in the monsterization of not only other people, but other things, right? Because we take certain species to be vermin, to be targeted for eradication. New York is launching its own like Destroy All the Rats project. I think developing a more long-term ecological practice that's rooted in developmental thinking helps us work through that, because it is a working through it. It's not going to be like, yeah, I just have to do this one thing, think this one thing, and that's going to be the end. I'm not going to monsterize anymore. It's a constant vigilance, and it's a constant practice. And most people don't have the time to do that. Most people don't have the tools to develop that kind of awareness. And so what it looks like in terms of a daily practice is going to vary, but I think those three things are like very important. And then just going to the places that scare you. I'm constantly reminding myself to do that, because often when you learn about the things that you're terrified of, it situates it in a kind of reality that's less scary. Was that the timer?